noted before, a slight displacement in the syllabus. The readings on social democracy and varieties of capitalism, which are on the course website, are for next week when we discuss European social democracy. So as I just mentioned, instead of going on, according to the original plan, to the discussion of progressive alternatives in the context of European social democracy, I want to continue the American discussion by addressing the progressive alternative in the United States, and then next week in Europe. So this week and next, in the American and European context, I will address the alternatives only in summary form and with a focus more on the initial steps than on the long-term direction. And then later in the course, in the second part of the agenda, I address the three great themes of democratizing the market, forming the capable individual, especially through education, and deepening democracy. And there, I hope, in a somewhat more systematic fashion, and with greater emphasis on the long-term direction rather than on the initial steps. You recall my view that the two most important attributes of a programmatic argument are first, that they mark a direction, and second, that they indicate in a particular setting the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. What matters is the direction, and the direction can be explored at any point closer or further to what exists. Remember last week, I discussed the message of the American prophets and criticized that message as well as describing it. And the whole of that initial part of the discussion could be summarized in a simple observation, that the religion of humanity, the commitment to increase our share in the godlike attribute of transcendence, suffers in each country from a characteristic set of perversions. In the United States, it has suffered from the tendency to overstate the extent to which the individual can save himself. Thus, the misapprehension of the relation between solidarity and self-construction. And from the tendency to understate the extent to which society and its institutions can be transformed. And these two errors, at once practical and spiritual, are intimately related to each other. The area of a troubled awareness of the relation of solidarity to self-construction, and the error of the institutional idolatry, which falsely supposes that a free society has a definitive institutional template. In the second part of last week's discussion, I explored, in relation to this criticism, the lessons that we might garner from American history in the attempt to reimagine the content of a progressive alternative in the American context. And one way of summarizing that discussion is to say that on the whole, the subsequent traditions of progressive reform in the United States have failed to maintain or reinvent the dynamic that helped create the country in the first place. The combination between mobilization of national resources from on top and selective democratization of the market order down below. And I argued in our discussion last week that the fundamental constraints on the weakening of that nation-building dynamic or dialectic have been, on the one hand, the weakness of democracy, and on the other hand, the illusions of thought. Now, against that background, then, I turn to the programmatic discussion in the United States. And as always, I'll stop always along the way, and invite your engagement. So we might distinguish three main axes of transformation and proposal. The first has to do with political economy. And we could put it under the heading of democratizing the market order. The second has to do with forming the capable agent, the individual, who can stand on his own feet and see beyond the context and act against it, as well as moving capably within it, with a special focus on the kind of education that such a democracy and such a democratized market order requires. And the third axis has to do with democratic politics itself and with its deepening. Now, again, to preserve the context of the aspiration of the discussion, I have to be very summary with regard to each of these themes of this ambitious agenda. So first, democratizing the market order. There is an analytical premise of great significance, which I've mentioned before, and comes into play heavily here. The premise is that a market order has no single natural and necessary form. The form that has prevailed in the North Atlantic world over the last 2 centuries, or the forms, represent a subset of a much larger range of possibilities. And if we are to pursue the defining aims of this project in political economy, we have to act on this premise. That is, it is not enough to regulate the market. It is not enough to attenuate the inequalities generated by the market through retrospective tax and transfer by means of progressive taxation or redistributed social spending. It is necessary to innovate in the arrangements that define the market, as the Americans did, according to my argument, in the early 19th century, especially with respect to the then crucial sectors of agriculture and finance. So we can distinguish four themes in this project of progressive political economy. All of them involve a progressive approach to the supply side of the economy, as well as to the demand side, to production as well as to consumption, contrary to what has been the overwhelming emphasis of the American progressives in recent decades. The first component has to do with the relation between the backward and the advanced parts of production, especially in the context of the emergence in all the major economies of the world of a new advanced practice of production, which we call the knowledge economy. The fate of the knowledge economy is of immense importance to society and to the progressive project. The second component has to do with the relation of labor to capital. And the change of the institutions and the laws that define this relation. The third component regards the relation of finance to the real economy, to the progressive agenda of society. And the fourth component has to do with the refinancing of the American state. Given that a state starved of resources, as to some extent the American state now is, could not undertake any of these projects that I'm about to outline. Now, one might say that all these themes that I'm about to explore are more or less obvious, but it is remarkable how distant they seem to be from the predominant political debate in the country, including the debate among the progressives. That debate, in many different ways, seems to evade the imperative of structural change and structural vision. So the first component, the relation of the backward to the advanced parts of production. And again, very summary form, the main idea, so we can discuss it and go forward and then come back to it in greater detail in the next part of the course. In every historical circumstance, there is a most advanced practice of production. It is not necessarily at its inception the most efficient practice. That is to say, the practice that generates the most output with the fewest inputs. But it is the practice that has the best chance of staying at the frontier of productivity and informing and inspiring the transformation of the entire production system. Previously, up until recently, that most advanced practice was what we call industrial mass production, or sometimes Fordist mass production. The large-scale production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and in very hierarchical and very specialized relations of production, the technical division of labor. Now we have another most advanced practice of production. And this is what we call the knowledge economy. It can't be understood simply as advanced manufacture or even less simply as high tech or as a combination of technologies. The technologies are just the materialization of a certain way of connecting our experiments in the transformation of nature to our benefit with our experiments in changing the way we cooperate. It is indeed dense in technology and science, as well as in the accumulation of capital, and devoted to permanent innovation. I won't stop now to characterize it in greater detail, because we're going to come back to it. It now exists in all the major economies of the world, in every sector of production, not just in advanced manufacturing. Notably in intellectually dense services, and indeed, advanced manufacture consists in large part in crystallized intellectual services. So the very distinction among sectors is attenuated in the age of the knowledge economy. However, in every part of production, it remains an island, a series of fringes, excluding the vast majority of workers and businesses. It has an insular character. It is an insular vanguardism. And over time, it seems that instead of spreading as mass production, the earlier vanguard did, it becomes even more confined. The masters of this insular form of knowledge economy, the firms and entrepreneurs that control its commanding heights, discover a way to divide it into two. The creative core they keep for themselves, and the part that can be routinized or transformed into commodities, in effect, or subcontract, to firms and workers in other parts of the world, and especially parts of the world where the returns to labor are low and the tax take as well is depressed. Now, the consequences of this insularity of the knowledge economy, of the new productive vanguard, are many and formidable. And especially with regard to economic stagnation on one side and economic inequality on the other side. So economic stagnation, there is a mystery. The economist Robert Solow quipped, "The computer revolution can be seen everywhere except in the productivity statistics." So there's this transformation, this revolutionary transformation, but it has coincided with a remarkable and persistent slowdown in the growth of productivity. Exactly the opposite of what might have been expected. Its theoreticians and ideologists, the economists who have formed the most influential view about it, claim that one of its characteristics is the potential for increasing returns to scale. And therefore, it presages explosive economic growth. Now, just the opposite has happened. And rather than attributing this slowdown in the rise of productivity and therefore in economic growth to the lower potential of contemporary technologies, especially artificial intelligence, when compared to the technological innovations of 100 years ago, we might attribute it to its failure to spread and to deepen by spreading. A practice of production reveals its potential only as it spreads across a wide range of situations in the production system. So what we have in this insular knowledge economy is a flawed, truncated, and veiled form of the new productive vanguard. That's the most straightforward explanation. The most straightforward explanation is that the most revolutionary practice, the one with the greatest potential to elevate productivity, is being denied to the decisive preponderance of firms and of workers. So you could broadly distinguish the economy from this standpoint into three parts. There's this creative fringe that excludes most people. Then there are the declining mass production industries, described in the United States as the Rust Belt. And then there's a vast economic periphery of services and small shops in which the great majority of workers of the labor force are stuck in relatively retrograde, isolated, primitive, and unproductive enterprises, denied access to the practices of the new vanguard, sort of confined, quarantined in the fringes. The other set of consequences has to do with inequality. There is a deepening chasm between the advanced and the backward parts of production. And this chasm then becomes a motor for the creation of inequality. The distance increases. The rise in productivity is concentrated in the small locomotive at the fringe of revolutionary or productive firms, and denied to the decisive majority of the rest. So then to attenuate this inequality by retrospective correction after the fact, through progressive taxation and redistributed social spending, the correction would have to be enormous. And it seems that it could never become enormous enough to correct the inequalities substantially without beginning to derange the established economic arrangements and incentives, and to exact an unacceptable cost in output. And so, in fact, the correction is marginal. Yes?
When you say denied, like, what do you mean by that? Because like it looks like it's some active effort by some players to deny.
No, it's not in that sense, as if it were a conspiracy that is being led by a small set of agents. It's denied in the sense that the established institutions, that's going to be my argument, the institutional arrangements deny it. So, but it's not a defined set of agents. Now, the technological and entrepreneurial elite looks around, like the Silicon Valley elite, and says, why aren't the rest like us? And then they come up with some simple-minded or partial solution, like the provision of a better kind of education. We can imagine that they might be very unhappy with the kinds of institutional and legal changes that I'm going to argue next would be necessary to the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy. At that point, we would be able to say not just that the institutional arrangements of the market would deny it, but that these elites would then deny it. So going back to a methodological point, which is of significance that came up before and will recur at every turn in these arguments. Remember the concept of the path of least resistance. So every time there's a set of innovations in the world, technological, organizational, institutional, or conceptual, the tendency is to adopt those innovations in the form that least disturbs the predominant interests and preconceptions. And in a way, you could say the whole insular knowledge economy, the knowledge economy such as it exists today, is an example of this path of least resistance. So the path of least resistance is always the most probable outcome, but it is never the necessary outcome. So the defenders of the path of least resistance have an advantage because what they defend or assume requires the least commotion and struggle. But they have a disadvantage, which is the inverse of the advantage of the challengers, which is that characteristically the path of least resistance fails fully to exploit the potential of the innovations for society. So that's what the enemies of the path of least resistance have going for them. So they then say, this insular form of the knowledge economy is incapable of achieving the potential of the knowledge economy. Witness, notably, the stagnation in economic growth and the decline in the rise of productivity. That's the kind of argument. So it's not as if there were simply a conspiracy focused on this elite. It is, of course, complicit with this situation and benefits from it. But the situation is not as if it were the result of a deal that they crafted in the back room. It's the result of the arrangements that are established in the society, which they more or less tacitly support. Yes?
But how would you contrast this idea with maybe the fact that nowadays you have like a lot of information available to anyone? For example, most of like the training that a person could do to become like an employee of Google and any big firm,
Yes.
you can find it for free on the
Sure.
internet.
But training is not enough, obviously.
And also like even the firms there, they have a big incentive to have more people skilled at the type of skill that they need. Like they need like a lot of things nowadays.
Yes,
So-
of course.
So like would not these like maybe facts like would like be a counter argument to like this?
No, I don't think so. No, I think that the consumers of their products and services have to have a certain level of skill. And they, of course, are interested in the diffusion of the skills so that their products and services can be desired and used. But that's quite different from the changes that would be required effectively to disseminate the knowledge economy. And that's then the object of an argument. We haven't come to that argument yet. So I think I mentioned in an earlier class, always the tendency is first to find some gimmick, some easy solution that would do it, like support the public schools better, or in the case of the governors in the United States, establish industrial and technological parks under heavy subsidies so that each state can have its little Silicon Valley. And it's only as that first wave of false solutions fails that we then have to look for something more consequential. So there's a pedagogy of disillusionment and defeat, which then leads to the discovery of the imperative of alternatives. So then on this view, again, I'm going to want to come back to later in greater detail, the deepening and diffusion of the market economy are two sides of the same process. They're not two separate things, as I just argued. A practice of production builds itself or reveals itself only as it spreads. So if it's confined, it doesn't show its potential. It shows it only in this fragmentary and distorted form. Its deepening and diffusion have a host of conditions. So one set of conditions has to do with the cognitive capabilities of the individuals, as you just suggested, and therefore with the spread of a certain kind of education. A second kind has to do with the formation of social capital, dense networks of association, which serve as the basis for the high level of trust and of discretionary initiative in the workplace that the knowledge economy requires. And a third set of conditions, which are especially troubling and ambitious, and are the ones on which for the moment I want to focus, have to do with the institutional and legal arrangements that are the background to the knowledge economy and its spread. So you can imagine then in a direction, a trajectory, and the trajectory going in successive steps from the very close, the proximate steps, to further off. So the first step, beginning modestly, but beginning modestly with revolutionary intentions, there would be a double focus. So on one side, the focus on expanding access to the resources and opportunities and capabilities of advanced production. So not just credit, but advanced practice, advanced technology, and advanced knowledge. And it couldn't be centrally managed by a centralized national bureaucracy. It would have to have a range of institutions intermediate between the central government and the producers. And you can begin to picture what that might look like by analogy to the 19th century system of agricultural extension. Agricultural extension in the first half of the 19th century that created family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial characteristics and with a whole set of mechanisms for managing risk, like agricultural and crop insurance, the cognitive basis of advanced agriculture, the land-grant colleges, and above all, with this system of extension in which the expert comes to the local producer and helps lift him up. So we can imagine a series of counterparts to that. We could call them generically industrial extension, focusing just on the industrial part of this. But of course, industry and services become more or less the same thing in this new economy. The other emphasis in this first stage is the diffusion of what works. So you don't know what works a priori. You have to discover. You discover and experience and experiment in this vast country. And it's necessary to have a procedure and a set of agents who study the comparative performance and discover what works. And then what works has to be disseminated, because it may not be disseminated spontaneously. So those would be the main emphases in the first stage. And up to that point, the initiatives don't seem to involve any fundamental change in the legal and institutional arrangements of the market order. As I said, an analogy to 19th century agricultural extension. Now then you can imagine a second stage further ahead, in which out of this partnership between government and the peripheral producers who are being lifted up, there begins to emerge a different architecture, a different legal architecture of the market order in the service of the deepening and dissemination of the most advanced productive practice. And that order might be described on two axes. The vertical axis of the relation between the government, central or local, and the producer, and the horizontal axis of the relation among the producers. So on the vertical axis, you know that there are now in the world, there have been for some time, basically two models of government-business relations. There's the American model of arm's length regulation of business by government. And there's the Northeast Asian model, the model of the Northeast Asian tiger economies, and originally as well the model of Japan, of the formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy, formulated and imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And what would be required then, under the conditions of the spreading and deepening knowledge economy, would be a model different from both of those. So it would have to be a form of partnership or strategic coordination between government and the producers that would be decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental. And it would have to work with this intermediate cadre of support centers, of entities that might be public-private or initially established by the government but given great autonomy and functioning under market constraints and market competition. That would be responsible for what a moment ago I called industrial extension. And then on the horizontal axis of the relation among producers, a 21st century counterpart to the 19th century practice of cooperative competition in agriculture, and which we actually see in some form in all these successful examples of the knowledge economy in the United States and in Europe. A significant element of pooling of resources, of circulation of resources among the firms in the vanguard. And this was formalized in 19th century agriculture in a form that in today's vocabulary, but not in the vocabulary of that time, we might describe as cooperative competition. In other words, the farmers then were independent proprietors and entrepreneurs, but they pooled physical, technical, and human resources. For example, they worked on one another's farms at harvest time. And in this way, they were able, despite their relatively small scale, to achieve economies of scale. And in the conditions of the knowledge economy, this regime of cooperative competition would have to be organized legally. So, for example, one of its characteristic legal instruments, which we already see, for example, in the relation between the pharmaceutical or biotech companies in the present productive vanguard, is the development of a different model of contract. Instead of the arm's length bilateral executory promise for an exchange of performances in the future, exhausted at the moment of performance, we have incomplete, ongoing, and relational contractual arrangements. So the main object of the contract is not a particular performance. It's the relation itself and the series of performances that will generate over time. And the terms are not fully bargained out as they are under the bilateral executory promise. So in legal terms, they are incomplete contracts. And so the development of a regime of cooperative competition requires innovation in private law, not just in public law. A characteristic of the social democratic settlement of the middle of the 20th century, in legal terms, was that the new body of public law, of the regulatory and redistributive state, was superimposed on the largely unchanged body of private law. And now there has to be innovation in that body of law, which is the fundamental mechanism of the market. The terms under which different economic agents gain access to what Marx called the means of production, the opportunities and resources of production. And those mechanisms are defined by the law of property and of contract, and they have to be reshaped. And that then would lead to the third stage, in which the unified property right, the traditional property right developed in theorized in the 19th century, would cease to be the only mechanism of economic decentralization. It would become one among many. So it has an advantage. Its advantage from an economic and social standpoint is that it allows an entrepreneur to do something that no one else believes in at his own risk, without having to negotiate some complicated set of vetoes. So the economist, the conservative economist Frank Knight once said, the historical justification of capitalism is the existence of a class of people willing to pay a premium for the privilege of running a risk. That's what the unified property right is good for. But it's not good for other things, because it doesn't permit the multiplication and superimposition of fragmentary or partial claims on the same productive resources. Claims not just by the investors, but by the workers, local communities, and local governments. And it's necessary to organize that legally and institutionally to achieve this deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy. So then, looking far into the future, we have the idea that the market order ceases to be fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself. And then different regimes of property and contract begin to coexist experimentally in the same market order. And each of them is good for some things and bad for other things. And we discover empirically and experimentally what they're good and bad for. And that then shows the practical significance of the analytical premise I mentioned at the outset, that the market has no single natural and necessary form. And that you can innovate in the legal constitution of the market order, in this case motivated by the goal of contributing to the deepening and dissemination of the new productive vanguard. Well, let me stop there, because that's a very succinct discussion of a complicated theme, but I'm just wanting to evoke for the moment what I mean by this idea of the transformation of the market order. Now, of course, this doesn't fit, for example, with the Marxist concept of capitalism, because the Marxist concept of capitalism, accepted by the right as well as by the left, is that it's a system, and you're either in the system or outside of the system. So consider this argument that I just gave of the three stages, ending in the innovation in the fundamental regimes of contract and property. At the end of the day, is that capitalism or is it something else? We don't know, because the concept of capitalism is a confusion. It's based on this idea that there are these systems, that you either manage them or replace them, that they're indivisible, that therefore there are the two kinds of politics, reformist management and revolutionary substitution. In my mind, all of these propositions are false. And what we now have in the world, and especially in the intellectual situation of the left, is that on the whole, they've ceased to believe in the heroic assumptions of Marx's social and economic theory, like this idea that there are this closed list of systems, each is indivisible, there are laws governing them. But they continue to use the vocabulary of the ideas in which they've ceased to believe. And that's the sign of immense confusion. And confusion always has practical consequences. So they talk about capitalism, but they don't really believe in the social theoretical assumptions of this idea of capitalism, that there's a system. Yes, you were going to say something? No? Yes.
You mentioned on the horizontal axis it would be the relation between the producers.
Yes.
And this could go back to the 19th century agricultural reform.
Yes.
So in this case, what would the objective of the firm look like? Because currently it is maximizing returns to shareholders or
Yes.
incentivizing the entrepreneur.
Yes.
But if such a cooperation is achieved, would it not promote the rise in productivity? And what would the objective of the firm
No,
be?
that's another discussion. So to my mind, none of this is incompatible with the idea that the defining objective of the entrepreneur and of the firm is to maximize its profit and value for the shareholders. That's another discussion. And so it's not that we are imagining a conversion of the entrepreneurs. They become more solidaristic. My immediate reaction in that conversation is that I don't want the entrepreneurs and the owners of assets to be the ones defining the objects of social benevolence. But it is a different discussion. So we're not expecting them to change their moral natures. we're just changing the institutional arrangements of the market order so that the knowledge economy ceases to be quarantined and it's able to spread. Now, mass production, the earlier vanguard, was by its nature associated with one sector, manufacture. Nevertheless, it put its stamp on the whole production system. Every part of production was changed on the influence of mass production, including agriculture. Now, why was it so easy, relatively easy? It's because mass production makes very minimalist requirements. So, and its content is stereotypical. So it's a group of machines, like the main types of machine cutting lathes, and the capabilities associated with them. They can be readily transported from one place to another. You put it on an airplane and you take it, as it were. That's not the case with the knowledge economy. And even with regard to education, you see that lip service is paid to education in traditional development economics. But the harsh truth is that very little is required by way of education from a worker in a mass production factory. You only need the three things: rudimentary literacy and numeracy, basic physical dexterity, especially hand-eye coordination, and a disposition to obedience. That's all you need. And so it was common in recruiting workers in the age of mass production to present them with a simple test. Turn your hands in opposite directions at the same time. The knowledge economy is not like that. So it has maximalist rather than minimalist requirements. And its deepening and dissemination are therefore a feat, not something that is automatic. That's at least the beginning of an explanation. So even though it should be in principle susceptible to rapid and universal dissemination, because it's not intrinsically associated with any one sector of the production system, we find the opposite. Instead of deepening and spreading, it's becoming progressively more confined through this process of bifurcation that I described, in which the entrepreneur discovers a way to commoditize a part of it. That's the part he gets rid of, with its fixed costs, with its ordeal of dealing with sullen workers and so forth. And then he focuses on the little creative elite that has all the fun and all the profits. That's what's happened in the trajectory of the knowledge economy, with these vast consequences that I described for economic growth. Now, is this part of the discussion, right, in the United States? No, not really. So you see that the right-wing populism and traditional progressive views, social democratic views in the United States basically have the same industrial policy. What is their industrial policy? Buying a few more years for declining mass production, restraints on plant closures, subsidies, threats, trade protection, and so forth. Nothing about the conversion of the superannuated form of production into the new vanguard. This is a theme of immense importance. Now, yes?
So why is it not part of the discussion? Do you think that getting it to be part of the discussion is the necessary first step?
Well, you can't have sustained change without ideas. You saw it in the critique of the New Deal. Roosevelt, despite his genuine experimentalism, was in the end hostage to the corporatist ideas that were dominant at the time of the early New Deal. So you can begin to experiment, as it were, by accident, but you can't sustain it without having an idea. And then the lack of imagination converges with the implications of what I was calling the path of least resistance. And so that's what happens in the world. The world, once again, the world is organized to reproduce itself. And in this struggle to reproduce itself, as it is, it gets vital help from the ease of the path of least resistance and from the lack of imagination. And then it continues on its way until there's a crisis and things break down. And the effort to find an alternative is then complicated by what the economists call a principal-agent problem. Because you propose an alternative to the union leader or to the politician. You say, this project of yours of buying a few more years for mass production has no future. So they may concede that it has no future, but they'll say, after it definitively sinks, I'll no longer be here, I'll be gone. And you, arguing for an alternative to the path of least resistance, want me to endanger my base before I have another one. And I'm not going to do that. So that's an example of how the short-term incentives on the leaders combined with the path of least resistance and the lack of ideas and of imagination can produce this result. But it is the result that in fact prevails all around us in the world that we're in. Now then, the second element, the second component, is the relation between labor and capital. And here it becomes very important to distinguish the short term from the long term. So, even on narrowly economic grounds, you could say it is impossible to sustain a dynamic of socially inclusive rise in productivity if there is a downward tilt in the returns to labor. If there is a huge reserve labor army, as Karl Marx called it, workers willing to work for less and less, then it will be much more plausible for the firm to opt for strategies that increase their ability to extract cheap labor rather than to innovate in the apparatus of production, except to the extent that they can do this bifurcation that I described. The insular knowledge economy, the hyper-insular knowledge economy that emerges from this bifurcation between creativity and commodities is accompanied all over the world by the increase in the proportion of the labor force that is abandoned to precarious employment, temporary, conditional, subcontracted labor, economically dependent wage labor disguised as self-employment, and so forth. And then in the major developing countries, the vast so-called informal economy, which is the counterpart to precarious employment with an economic dualism, a division between the organized and unorganized parts of the economy. That is a context which is inauspicious, hostile to the project of an inclusive knowledge economy. If there are these masses of workers relegated to radical economic insecurity with a downward tilt to the returns to labor. So there has to be a fix. And one element in the fix in the short term is the creation of a new set of labor laws in the United States, alongside, not substituting for, the traditional regime of collective bargaining. And the aim would be to organize, represent, and protect these precarious workers. So you could say there'd be a sliding scale. The less they are organized and represented, the more they have to be protected by direct legal intervention in the employment relations. And the less they are organized and represented, the more they are organized and represented, the less they have to be protected. That's the sliding scale. And then what is the aim of the protection? The protection is to distinguish the legitimate aim of flexibility from the dangerous and illegitimate aim of consigning the workers to insecurity and depressing the wage. So there are basically two discourses on labor in the world today, including in the North Atlantic world. There's the traditional labor discourse of defending the organized minority of the labor force, which is a smaller and smaller minority. And now, increasingly, no longer anchored in mass production industry, which was its historical base, but anchored in public employment. So having no relation to the industrial system, increasingly. And then the official discourse of institutionally conservative social democracy and the union leaders is, we'll protect them, we'll maintain this historical system, against the interests of the disorganized majority of the labor force. So that's one discourse. And the other discourse is the neoliberal discourse, which under the name of flexibility, in the name of flexibility, in fact, consigns the majority to radical insecurity and to the repression of the wage. Now then we need a third discourse, a third project, which says we in fact cannot prohibit by decree the new relations of production. And they do require flexibility. But we can't allow flexibility to result in radical economic insecurity. So for example, one form of the direct legal intervention in the employment relation to the end of distinguishing flexibility from insecurity, aside from the effort to represent and organize the precarious workers, is to formulate a principle of price neutrality. So temporary work or work performed under precarious legal form would in principle have to be remunerated by a standard equivalent to the analogous work performed under conditions of stable employment. Now, of course, to become practical, that idea has to be transformed into a set of standards. There has to be whole jurisprudence of this equivalence. But that, after all, is what lawyers do and have always done. So that's not an impossible task. That's just another project. So that's, as it were, an example of the short term. But always in the short term, it's necessary to have a view of the long term. And now I'm just going to cite dogmatically three elements in this long term. Because come back to them in the discussion of the democratizing of the market. So the first element has to do with the relation of the worker to the machine. And I mentioned this in an earlier class. In Henry Ford's assembly line or Adam Smith's pin factory, the worker works as if he were one of his machines. Formulaic, repetitious movements, like the movements of the machines, characteristic of mass production industry. In a deepened and disseminated knowledge economy, we have a different idea. The idea is that everything that we have learned how to repeat, we express in an algorithm or a formula, and we then embody the algorithm or the formula in a physical contraption of the machine. The point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our supreme resource, our time, which is life itself, for the not yet repeatable, for what we have not yet learned how to repeat. And no human being should be condemned to do the work that can be done by a machine. So this is part of the higher aim of looking for freedom, not just from the economy, but in the economy. And then we think it's the relation between the machine and the anti-machine, the human being, is much more powerful than either of them alone. So let's say that's one long-term objective. Now, that objective is unlikely to be achieved so long as economically dependent wage labor remains the predominant form of free labor. So actually, in the hierarchy of what Marx regarded as the distinctive characteristics of the system, capitalism, he put at the top that human labor is bought and sold. And he understood socialism as being, among other things, the overcoming of that situation, which free labor involves the buying and selling of work. But he was not alone, because up until the end of the 19th century, all the major liberal as well as socialist thinkers regarded economically dependent wage labor as a defective and transitory form of free work, retaining many of the characteristics of serfdom and slavery. And their aim, expressed by John Stuart Mill or by Abraham Lincoln in his, for example, in his speech to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society, was the substitution of wage labor by the two higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation. And this was natural for an American to think, because, as I mentioned, when Tocqueville came to the United States in the 1830s, only 1 in every 5 white men worked for another white man. The vast majority of the population was self-employed, independent proprietors and tradespeople. And that was the fundamental nature of the society, and helps to explain how they came to think of themselves. But how can self-employment and cooperation among the self-employed to achieve economies of scale, how can that be organized practically and legally? And that then takes us to the third long-term goal, innovation in the basic legal arrangements of the market order. So a multiplication of the forms by which the legal mechanisms under which the economic agent can gain access to productive resources and opportunities. For example, temporarily, it can be these vast funds established by the state but independently managed. And whoever can assure these funds the highest rate of return for the use of those then gets to use them temporarily. So capital belongs to society. And the underlying rate of interest, which would be the charge for the use of these productive funds, then becomes the basic way of financing the state instead of taxation. So the three goals are interconnected. They're overlapping of the long term. No one does work that can be done by a machine. Economically dependent wage labor ceases to be the natural or predominant form of free work. And the market order is no longer fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself. And from that standpoint, then, the attempt to gain control over the phenomenon of precarious employment becomes only an initial step in this direction. So that's just to evoke the general idea that we have to explore further. It is unnecessary to say that none of this is part of the programmatic discussion of the progressives, really. And it's important to have a view of the long-term direction, always for the reason cited by Montesquieu. No wind helps us if we don't know to what port we're sailing. We have to have even a provisional conception of the direction. And it involves cumulatively in successive steps reorganization of the market order, rather than just regulation or corrective redistribution, to the end of making the democratized market order rest on the principle of free labor, really free, not a simulacrum of freedom. And has to be reshaped. Now let me again stop there. At least the immediate step of the problem of precarious employment seems to me to be a defining issue. Would someone speak to that? Yes.
If the end is to eliminate mechanistic labor, is there any sense in which we might need to rely on mechanistic labor as a means to that end?
Sure, because that objective, like the other two, I described as long-term. And so, of course, there's the question of the bridge to that. And it's a question of degree. It's not all or nothing. But what we would not want is that when labor is expensive or not adequately qualified, the firm opts for the advanced technologies in a form that substitutes labor rather than complementing labor. And where labor is abundant and cheap, then the firm opts for having workers who work as if they were machines. So those two outcomes are, of course, the predominant outcomes in the world. And they're both incompatible with a larger progressive objective. So that's a way of defining it. And how do we get to this other outcome, this third outcome? And clearly, it can't be just by a transformation of the labor laws, not just one component, because everything else matters. The system of education, the organization of politics, and so forth. That's the idea. No, yes.
Yes, I was thinking about the more pressing issue of those who have where I was thinking more about the gig economy and
Yes, what I call precarious.
yes, yeah. I
So
can-
it's self-employed, wage labor disguised as self-employed.
Exactly, and it made me sort of think about the AB5 or AB5 bill that was passed in California that they're trying to subvert this, and I was curious, like, is like a bill and something like that an accurate way to go about this change? If
It
it's
could be, that's a
Mhm.
practical question, but unmasking this pseudo self-employment
yes,
can obviously be a help.
Mhm.
And it can be a decisive move.
but it can't be done alone. That's what you're saying.
Well, this is a recurring problem, this programmatic arguments, because here, and this is very important to bring out early in the argument. So I don't think of all of these pieces as a system. So it's not like the Marxist things. It's all a system. So you either do it together or you don't do it, and you humanize the existing world. So there are these structures which are the formative institutional arrangements and ideological assumptions of society. And they exercise enormous influence, and they are recalcitrant to change. And to some extent, they organize themselves in a way that resists change, and they're assisted by forms of thought that make them not just hard to change, but almost invisible. But that doesn't mean that they're systems. It's like a gingerbread construction. It's the contingent product of many sequences of practical and visionary strife. And that has consequences for how we imagine their transformation. So to change them is what I'm calling structural change.
Mm-hmm.
Structural change is any change in the formative institutional arrangements or ideological assumptions of the organization of politics or the organization of the economy. And especially change that shapes how we can create the future within the present. That's structural change. But contrary to the Marxist assumption on this view that I'm defending, structural change is almost never totalistic change. That the idea of changing, quote, the system is like a fantastical limited case of how structural change really happens in history when it happens. It is fragmentary. And because it is fragmentary, then every single episode of structural change has an ambiguity familiar to the agent. It can be an excuse not to change more, or it can be a stepping stone to the next level of change. Well, that's just the way things are. And in real politics, in real history, the meaning of a move, of an initiative, always depends on what comes next. So it's the sequel that retrospectively sells the meaning of what just happened. And that's the nature of real transformation. So then with respect to an argument like this one, given this understanding of the nature of these structures, we don't need to, and we can't change everything at the same time. But nevertheless, the different parts are connected. So what characteristically happens in our experience is that we start on one front, like industrial extension, speaking about the relation between the backward and advanced parts of the economy. We advance, and then we hit against a limit. And we discover that we can only advance further on that front if we advance on some other front. So that too is what happens. And that's what we could call combined and uneven development, using Chomsky's phrase for different purposes. So that seems to me to be a direct implication of this way of understanding structure and structural change. So it is true that to continue changing some things, we have to change other things. But it's not true that they're all part of a system, and that we either change everything or we change nothing. That's not true. That's an illusion, and that's a dangerous illusion, which, as I argued before, becomes an alibi for its opposite. So I said, if we're really mad, if the fundamental change we want would be this total change, well, that's impossible. Or if it's possible, it's too dangerous. So then we become these humanizers of the inevitable. And that's a very typical evolution of the contemporary progressive. He used to be a revolutionary or a Marxist when he was 25 years old, and then he grew up and he understood that fundamental change is impossible or too dangerous, and so now he becomes a humanizing social democrat. This is a tragedy for the society and for the individual. So we need a different set of ideas and practices to find our way out of that. Yes.
So I would love for you to speak to the difference, like specifically between is this sort of, you're talking about like a true difference between systemic and structural change? Is that?
Yes, so I wouldn't call this a system at all.
Okay.
I'd say it is a structure, but a structure, not system.
Mm-hmm.
That if by system we mean something like the Marxist idea of the mode of production, which is a system on Marxist understanding. It's like you begin to unravel it, but then the whole spool of thread unravels because it's all together. It stands or falls as a single piece. And that results as a corollary in this binary idea of politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's either stabilizing reformism or it's revolutionary substitution. Well, and that's then the theoretical background to the conversion of the idea of revolution into an alibi for its opposite, which is what we have in the world. And so you can't think clearly about these things unless you begin to clarify the assumptions. Yes?
Can you speak to how an idea like universal basic income falls in this spectrum? Because I can see it as sort of a reform impulse of like a social insurance.
Absolutely.
Or something fundamental.
So it's related. It's a species of an idea of immense significance for society, for the progressives, which I referred to earlier in the form of this notion of a dialectic between a haven of security in vital protected interests and capability assuring endowments, which are separate from any job or position in the social division of labor. You have those universally. Now, that can take many different forms. And of course, education and the claim to education, not just originally, but throughout one's life, is one of the main forms. And another form is the idea of a social inheritance. So the social inheritance can take the form of minimum basic income, or it can take the form of a claim on assets. So the state could settle, like, according to the level of wealth and government, a little trust fund on each individual. And say you can draw on that fight at turning points in your life to change direction, to do something consequential. So that idea of having a haven in a progressive vision should be the reverse side of something else. And this is what, in one of these previous classes, I call the store. Remember, I compared to the relation of the parent to the child. The parent says to the child, I love you unconditionally. In my love, you have security. Now go out and raise a storm in the world. That's the crucial relation. Now, what's happened in the discourse of these fundamental rights and endowments is that, on the whole, the part about the storm is missing. Where's the part about the storm? So there are these two stories. There's a story about the haven. But why do we give the haven? We give the haven so that the individual, on that basis, can go out into the world and, unafraid, can shake things up. Don't stay out of trouble. Look for trouble. Do things. And you'll have this basic security. The security is for that. But that isn't something that happens spontaneously. It has to be organized. And so what I'm calling the democratized market order, or the deeper high-energy democracy, are elements of the organization of the store. And that's the way in which I would want to argue later, especially, for example, in the discussion of education, how we should think. So the predominant temper of the progressives has become timorous, so they're focused on the protection. But the protection isn't enough, because the storm, in the form in which we would want it, doesn't arise spontaneously in the world. We have to orchestrate this storm. And then we think that the security and the storm are the fundamental counterparts. The individual is secure, but everything in society is thrown open to conflict. So, the business schools and the managerial elites have sometimes been preoccupied with this apparent paradox in the practice. You have to make people secure, and then you have to scare them out of their wits. These seem to be a flat contradiction. But on this reading that I'm giving of the relation between the haven and the storm, they're not contradictory, they're complementary. But in this view of the progressive project, it can't be fear that is motivating us. We want to make the individual unfearful, not fearful. But what really drives us is hope of a bigger life for the ordinary man and woman. And so that this is the essential idea of democracy, democratic experimentalism. We're not as small as we seem to be. Yes?
I have a related question to that. Do you have any worries that in a world where we've automated everything manual, or workers' main output is ideas that have asked, populace will lose a sense of purpose and individualism when they might not be required in that world?
Because workers would be rendered superfluous by machines, is that the idea?
Right, and perhaps in that world we won't need as many workers creating ideas as we do creating products.
Well, I think that most economists would say, attacking the fallacy of the so-called lump sum theory of labor, that our experience is that technologies that might evolve to simply to substitute labor under certain conditions that I mentioned, can also be designed and have their context shaped so that they evolve to complement labor. And that combination is much more powerful, has much more potential than either the worker or the machine alone. But of course, we're at the very early stages of this process. So that's the famous debate about automation and its consequences, in which, once again, it seems to be we should be empirical and hopeful. And we know that the evolution of technology is not autonomous. It is influenced by this context of incentives and interests. And the machines can be designed either to replace labor simply or to complement labor. And so we have to create the basis under which that experiment can take place on a very wide field. But this theme, that you raised in your comment just now, raises the momentous question of what a moment ago I called the distinction between freedom from the economy and freedom in the economy. So the view shared by Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes and many others is work is a hateful burden. Fortunately, scarcity is about to be overcome. And then we'll enter this world in which we won't have to work, and we can experiment with poetry, fishing, and so forth, like Marx in the Critique of the Godot program. I think, contrary to what they believe, that scarcity is not about to be overcome, but that we can hope for more than freedom from the economy. We can hope for freedom from the economy. So, in the economy. So, the different practices of production differ, among other things, in the extent to which they allow us to be free in production. So it's not a speculation. You just have to compare the degree of freedom that exists in the locomotive, the forward edge of the insular knowledge economy, with the degree of freedom that existed under mass production. Mass production is a command and control structure. And this system of production not only allows, but requires from its participants a higher level of discretionary initiative and reciprocal trust. And it draws more closely together production and imagination. So that's a different experience of work. And the question is, under what conditions can that experience of work be rendered available to a larger part of humanity? That's entangled with this question of the insular or inclusive knowledge economy now. Those questions are all connected. Now here's a third element in the question, in the matter of the political economy of the progressives. So we were discussing the relation of the backward to the advanced parts of production, the relation of labor to capital. Now comes a third relation, the relation of finance to production. So let's begin with three enigmas about the present situation, the present arrangements relating finance to production. The first enigma is that under the present arrangements, production is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. All empirical study has demonstrated that well over 80–85% of the financing of production is internally generated in the production system itself. Well, that then raises an obvious question, which is so simple that it's not asked. So the question is, what then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? This trading activity that in practice seems to have only an episodic or oblique relation to the financing of production. For example, initial public offers in the stock market are a tiny fraction of the activity of the capital markets. Now comes the second enigma. The second enigma is that under the current arrangements, finance seems to be largely indifferent to the real economy in good times, and then becomes destructive in bad times. So it's the asymmetry. It's not just that it's useless to a large extent, is that it becomes dangerous. And we might come to think that the best way to make it less dangerous is to make it more useful. Now comes the third enigma. Third enigma is that the activity that you might in principle regard as the most important responsibility of finance, which is to fund the creation of new assets in new ways, is in fact a minuscule part of the activity of the capital markets. So it's most clearly related to venture capital. The United States is the country in the world, a large economy in which venture capital is most established. A small economy would be Israel. And even in these economies in which venture capital is most established, it's tiny in comparison to the other activities of the capital markets. So how could it be that the most important activity from the standpoint of society occupies so small a portion of the total activity of the capital markets? So these three enigmas are all related to the same problem. The problem of the variable relation of finance to the real economy. It is a variable, it is not a constant. Now this may at first seem obvious, but it is in direct contradiction to the orthodox way of thinking about finance. The orthodox way of thinking is that if there is a problem in the allocation of capital by the capital markets, the problem must result from some localized competitive defect in the operation of the capital markets, including asymmetry of information. Or else, from a localized defect in the regulatory response to the localized market defect. What this way of thinking excludes is the possibility that different legal and institutional arrangements could either tighten or loosen the relation of finance to the real economy. So, under certain arrangements, we might experience what you could call financial hypertrophy. Finance becomes bloated. It absorbs a larger and larger part of the profits and the talent in the economy, as opposed to financial deepening, which would be the enlistment of finance in the service of the productive agenda of society. So on this argument, that's not a constant, that's a variable. And different arrangements can either tighten or loosen the connection. So the principle would be, finance can be a good servant, but it is always a bad master. And the issue is, under what arrangements do we organize its relation to the productive agenda of society? So the term financialization, often used, and especially by the progressives, the financialization of the economy is just a way of referring to that loosening of the link between finance and production, with all these bad consequences that I just listed. So then the issue becomes, and what can we do about it? Now, just to return to the historical example, or again, in the United States, I mentioned the selective democratization of finance in the 19th century. When the Americans dissolved the Second Bank of the United States under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and went on to prohibit interstate banking and to organize the most decentralized banking system that had ever existed in the world. They were experimenting in the tightening of the link between finance and production. They weren't regulating the financial market. They were creating a different kind of financial market. And which we can understand in this vocabulary of the tightening. Putting finance at the service of the local producer to a greater extent than it was before. That's all it means. So then we have programmatic implications, both negative and positive. And I don't want to go into detail, but just give you the general idea so you can understand the content that is being invoked. So negatively, you might discourage or prohibit financial activities that have no colorable relation to the expansion of output or the increase of productivity. So, example, derivative contracts, options, developed historically in the commodity markets, and especially in agriculture. And their main function was to increase liquidity and organize the allocation of risk. Now, it's not clear that they have the same function or justification in the equity markets. So even though they were invented as a device for managing risk, they seem to have been converted in the equity markets into an instrument of gambling. And the gambling unrelated to the productive agenda of society. So why should we want that? Because that's a diversion or a squandering of the productive potential of capital. Now then you could think that there would be a positive counterpart to that, which is a series of innovations to tap the dormant productive potential of a large part of the capital saved in the world, in the public and private pension systems, for example. So you take a part of that money, you put it into diversified portfolios, independently managed under market constraints and benchmarks of performance. And if private capital is not reaching this vast periphery of retrograde enterprises, the state organizes the equivalent to venture capital, not under centralized direction, but operating through this intermediate cadre of entities subject to market competition and market-based performance and remuneration, until private venture capital can step in, or if it doesn't, it continues. But that's just an example. So the disconnection of finance from the real economy is not like just a blind fate. It's the product of a series of historical arrangements. And so that would then be a third element in the political economy of the progressives. So going back, you struggle to overcome the chasm between the advanced and backward parts of production. You intervene in the relation of labor to capital to prevent the immiseration of labor and its consignment to precarious employment and radical insecurity, with an idea of the long-term direction in mind. And you enlist finance in the service of production, making it less dangerous by making it more useful. Those are elements of a progressive political economy. Where are they? So it's not as if this was some big mystery. These are sort of the obvious practical subjects of these societies. There's a fourth thing I wanted to come to when we run out of time, which is the refinancing of the American state. But let's stop there, and we do have a few minutes to discuss this question of finance and the new economy. Yes?
Yes, put it in the practical ways that suppose that the idea presented is correct, but just like wear a suit and try to alter it, it's all depend on the current system or the current personnel, another politician, entrepreneur, or the other institution. Of course, we have a constitutional legitimacy, we have a institutional arrangement, but how it happened, it depends on the current people. So
Yes.
we relied on one leadership, or you believe
Correct.
that the American system now can really innovate the ideal you just present.
Yes. So, but what is the question then?
The question is how-
Who is the agent, or how does this happen?
Yes, so how can it happen? You rely on the current personnel,
Yeah.
or
Well, the traditional way in which this happens in real political struggle is there's a path of least resistance, that's what exists. It's the path that involves least disturbance of the raiding interest and preconceptions, but it has a cause. It fails to exploit the potential of finance, of the knowledge economy, of labor under the knowledge economy, and so forth. Then, out of a mixture of base and noble motives, there's a struggle. So, for example, within the elites, within the national elites, someone embraces the alternative and appeals to the masses below. And in the struggle within the elite, presenting himself as the captain of the people. And then you have movements in society. So that's how it happens. Out of some strange mixture of idealism and base ambition, there's a struggle. There are movements below, and on top in the national elites, there's internecine conflict, and the ambitious tie their cause to a national project and appeal to the people. So that's how it's always happened in history. Now, to the extent that we could progress in the organization of democracy, we would make structural change less hostage to intra-elite conflict. But then we need a different kind of democracy. After all, one way of thinking about the function of institutions is that institutions exist to economize on virtue. So vision, leadership, sacrificial impulse, married to blind ambition, these are all relatively scarce resources. They exist, and that's why the world changes despite itself. But they're scarce resources. So that's how it changes now, but that's not how it would have to change in the future, because we would want to organize a system, in particular a system of democratic politics, that would make the structural change less dependent on this exceptional vision or political virtue. So that's the reality. But we have to get from here to there. So there's always a puzzle in the world, which is that structural change of any kind, even if it is fragmentary, as for the most part it must be, almost invariably seems all but impossible prospectively, and then natural or inevitable retrospectively. So, what else is new? That's how things are. I didn't invent that. I didn't make the world this way, but that's how it is. So wasn't my plan to take so much time in this because we still have to continue. But it does serve the purpose of beginning to lay out the elements of progressive alternative in the American context. Continue.
Well, it was great to have him swing, but I won't find out unless that's hopefully this week.
What was the outcome?
Oh, so there's just 3 tiny towns that. It's great.
And are you going?
Yes, we had our first 2 meetings last week, and then because of the scheduling, you can let me know. Just a reminder. For those of you in the college, you guys pick up the assignment for the paper due on Monday. So because the schedule, split up. Yeah.
Specialized.